What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me in the show is Douglas Ferguson, and we talk about prototyping, because basically you can prototype everything. And even more interestingly, Douglas shares with us what comes after the prototype, so the nitty-gritty, hairy stuff. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, why don't you visit workshops.work to download my one-page summary? So lean back and enjoy the show. Douglas, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, and I must admit that it took me a lot of willpower to stay away from your book and not start reading it so that I can keep all my naive curiosity to be on the same page with the audience. And then I will read it afterwards to double check whether you told me the full picture.
Yeah, I'll be curious to hear your thoughts after reading, especially since we haven't had a chance to talk before.
Yes. So we're going to talk about what comes after the prototype.
That's right.
And maybe you can give us a little bit of background. So where are you coming from? What led you to write this book, Beyond the Prototype?
Yeah,
would you call yourself a facilitator?
Yes, I do call myself a facilitator. And it's a funny journey because looking back, it kind of all makes sense, but I never would have thought I would have ended up here. I started my career off as a software developer, and as a developer was really interested in the intersection of the user and the technology. And so I saw so many of my peers just fascinated with the elegance of getting the bits to do the things they're supposed to do, and the kind of getting really hung up on technology for technology's sake. And so spent a lot of time just examining that kind of mode of thinking and understanding kind of what alternatives there were there. And that led me to extreme programming and later agile and scrum and lean and these things. And as I was leading teams and startups as a CTO, I stumbled upon the design sprint process and had my teams running the design sprint. And then Google Ventures invested in my startup, and I got to work directly with Jake, which kind of turned that kind of, pen pal kind of relationship into an in-person relationship. And I got to see firsthand what they had learned by running these things with so many different people, and just watching the way they worked and thinking about what I really loved about leadership and working with my teams and inspiring and empowering folks. I realized I started to get a kernel of an idea that, wow, maybe there's an opportunity to do these things with teams that, the one little piece that I love so much, can I do that a lot versus it just being a component of some other career or other piece of work. And that's what led me to start researching and studying other types of facilitation, other methodologies, and starting to realize that everything's quite siloed as far as, there's the design sprint community, there's the liberating structures community, there's the art of gathering people, and they don't really cross-pollinate too much, which I think is a sad thing. But coming back to the Beyond the Prototype question, so because I wanted to give you a little bit of a background or backdrop on how I was going to answer. And as I started to do more and more design sprints, I started to realize that there was no guide to what to do after. And because of the hype and the excitement around the process, there's more and more people doing them. It's also a 5-day process, which requires people to do a lot of convincing, right? To have the leadership say, yes, it's okay to do this. Then they have to really hype it and sell it. And in doing so, people can get really blind to the fact that the design sprint is not the answer. It can push us forward really quickly, but we still have to shepherd this work, and we had to be there for it to maintain this momentum. So I saw so many people struggling after the design sprint. I'm like, what do we do next? And even the people that were having success afterwards were commenting like, well, there's no guidebook, there's no manual on how to do this. And I thought it would be really fascinating to start a conversation about that. And one of the issues is that this is a complex problem. It's not a situation where a cookie cutter solution is going to be adequate. We can't just say, go follow this process post design sprint. And so I wanted to at least talk about the issues that come up and some potential tactics, but realizing that every company is different and everyone has their needs. But if we can at least start to have a conversation about it and, build an awareness that this can happen.
And is there a specific prototype you have in mind? So what is it that you understand by a prototype? And is there something that you cannot prototype?
Yeah, I find that question very fascinating. I believe that prototyping is a mindset. So when we teach prototyping, we have a skill building workshop where we help people hone their prototyping skills. And we really teach it as a mindset. And I think that, there's very few things you can't prototype if you are approaching prototypes from that perspective. And the standpoint that a prototype is just there to answer a question. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite examples of a prototype is a 5-pound weight. And we were working with a scientific measurement company, and they got a request from some clients, and we're starting to realize there was this new potential product that they were thinking about building, and had their engineers take a first swag at it. And they came back with some specifications and some questions around, would it be okay if kind of statements. Mm-hmm. And one of them was, we're thinking, if we repurpose some of our existing capabilities and materials, we think it would come in around 5 pounds. And do you see any concerns with that? And along with a host of other questions, they went to talking to humans and people who would be using this piece of equipment, and came back pretty convinced that it would be okay. And one of the designers just, it didn't quite sit well with her. And so she went to digging around her garage and found a 5-pound weight and took it out to the customers and said, hey, can you hold this in the air just above your head for about, 15 seconds, and then pull it back down to about your waist, and kind of look down as if you're taking a reading. Do that about 30 more times. And then after a few tests, the clients were saying, maybe this could be a little lighter. So that's a great example of a prototype. She had a question around, was 5 pounds too heavy? And simply asking the client is not a very good test. So how can we simulate the future in a way that will help us accurately answer the question? So that, to me, that's a prototype. And I once prototyped, I was moving a giant recording console into my recording studio. I had to go through 2 doors that were 90 degrees from each other. So basically, you go through one door, you make a sharp turn to the left and go through another door, and they were very close, not even 6 inches from each other. And so with that hard turn, there's not a lot of room to maneuver. And so I had several buddies, because this thing weighed I think it was 950 pounds. So it's just shy of a ton, so I brought some friends in to help me. And it was about 50-50. About half the folks said, there's no way it's going to make it. And the other half's it'll make it. And I thought, maybe we should, before I go trying to jam this thing in here, let's, so I went and just grabbed some strips of lumber that I had laying around. This is some thin strips of 1x4 and stuff, and measured it all out and created a frame that was the same size. But it was very light. And it was very easy for me to throw it together. And it's also, if it got damaged, no big deal. And so that allowed us to figure out the path that we wanted to take and to prove that it would exist. So then, because it was a real magical moment, once I proved that it exists, then all the naysayers were much more cooperative, because they weren't spending their time trying to tell me that it wasn't going to work. Yeah. Instead, they knew it was going to work, and they were helping push the solution forward.
Awesome example. Thank you for sharing it. And then I'm very tempted to answer my own question now, but I still ask you. So are there prototypes that are prone to fail? And if so, how would you characterize them?
I would say the ones that fail the most are the ones that don't have really strong questions guiding their creation. So when people say, oh, I want to make this thing that I think people might like, and I just put it in front of them. I mean, that's a fairly weak question. It's still a question. There are others that just, it seems like there's almost like not much clarity around what people are hoping to learn. And so without having this goal in mind or this question that you're trying to solve, it's the value is much diminished. But there's still value. I would argue there's still value in creating things, and this is just the fact that just the process of doing it, you learn from it. But you can amplify your learning so much more if you come in with a really strong question that maybe could surface assumptions that you have, etc. I would also think that there's a classification of prototypes, and I struggle with this a little bit because I don't really define prototypes in this way, but if folks have this kind of what I would call a skewed definition, essentially it's thinking of prototypes as a proof of concept, right? And so they've taken, I think they're overbuilding their prototypes. And the reason that people would overbuild a prototype is because they're not clear on the question they're trying to solve. And so that level of fidelity that you need and or the level of resolution that you need is not apparent.
And I see another risk in overbuilding a prototype is then you get attached to it, because the more work you put into it, then the more attached, and then you might be less willing to actually kill the darling if it doesn't work, or you become blind to the real information that it might not work.
Yeah, it's like the sunk cost fallacy too, right? Like you've invested so much time. It's like, I can't undo that. Jake had a really awesome graph in the Sprint book. I don't know if you remember it, but it was a willingness to change graph. So on the y-axis, we've got willingness to change, and on the x-axis, we've got time. And so you start off with a high willingness to change, and it was even a little quote, kind of like simulating like your mood or your perspective at that point. And it's like, man, it's really great to get all this feedback from users. And then the curve, like as time progresses, your willingness to change, just like it's like an S curve. You're just going to die off exponentially, and then it kind of smooths out. And at the end, it's a little mood bubble that says, these stupid customers, what do they know?
Awesome. I can also imagine that the shape of this willingness to change can also be related to the fact that you realize all the work that actually has to be done. Because while you're building this prototype or testing, you're in touch with the user and you're excited, you're creative, and then you step out of the workshop room and then the real work actually starts. So the nitty-gritty stuff where you're not in a creative room, but you're mostly behind your desk.
Yeah. Also just coming back to the point you made a second ago, the longer you spend with the prototype, the more your ideas become darlings, because you're kind of in this creative process, and you're just, it's so easy to get drunk or excited on this just flow of excitement, right? And then you might even be co-creating with colleagues, right? And it's just building on building things. And it's a real letdown when someone comes and like says that stuff's not cool, And so the sooner that stuff can happen, and you can focus all that energy, all that team creation, that room intelligence, if you can position and target it toward the things that you're starting to hear the customers really get excited about, then you're reducing the likelihood that you're going to spin down some territory or get really attached to something that users don't like. And then you're right, even if you're doing that work, there's this phenomenon that can happen where you figure these things out, you're co-creating with the client, but then there's a reality sets in like a ton of bricks. It's like, oh, now we have to build it. And it just reminds me of a situation that I encounter quite often when I get excited with other facilitators. We're like, oh, we should do something together. And then we start brainstorming on how to design a masterclass, and we put it all together, and we have a few calls. And then we put it all together. We have our prototype. And then now we have to market it, we have to sell it, we have to find a date for it, and then it kind of vanishes and goes somewhere in the nirvana. Yeah, that's like the messy middle, right? Yeah. I think too, if it's possible to continue are there ways to continue prototyping? The story you just shared with me reminded me of how Daniel and I typically work. And for the listeners, I should make sure that, because Daniel, but they might not. So Daniel Stillman and I collaborate quite often. And, the phenomenon you're describing is typically how we work. We'll start chatting to get excited about something. And then, we'll create like a paper prototype. It's like just the concept down. And then even the first time we do it, we'll often think of as a prototype. And I think that really serves us well because our expectations are lowered on that first one. Mm. And so the first time that we'll ever do like a brand new concept, we just we just have lowered expectations on number of tickets sold or amount of revenue. And I think that serves us well in the sense that, we can still go through with it and there's still a ton of learning because, if the ones that do come, we can better understand what got them excited about it. We can, there are things that maybe slowed us down that we won't realize until, as we reflect on it later. And so we have zero opportunities to fix those things unless we actually make an attempt at it. And so the prototype doesn't have to be a completely fake thing. It can be, you can continue to make it more and more real over time.
So when you introduced your story, you mentioned that you worked at the interface between the user and the tech when you still worked with startups. And I wonder whether now with all the work that you're doing around prototypes, you're working on the interface between the user and a workshop.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think facilitation is about working in the intersection. And so the prototype is a nice tool to interface a team or anyone working on a product or a solution or a service with the potential user. It's also, the workshop itself is a great interface to help the team work together. And the prototype can also be an interface for working with other parts of the organization. And so even though we're typically using it to learn about the user or other people who might interact with this product or this thing that you're interested in building, it can also be a fantastic way to socialize your concept throughout the rest of the organization. Because so many times I've been in meetings where senior leaders have been talking about what they're planning on doing for months. And then we take the prototype and we share that out, and the senior leaders are saying to themselves, is that what you meant? And it's like, man, it's amazing that you've been talking about this for so long. And then once we actually realize it and simulate it in any kind of fashion, then it just becomes so much more tangible. It's like a lot of times people talk about, should we do high fidelity prototypes? And it's kind of somewhat a religious debate. And my take on it is that any ambiguity in your prototype is going to be ambiguity in your insights and your feedback. And so you have to be comfortable with that ambiguity. And that comes back to do we understand what we're hoping to learn? And if we want to make sure that other leaders fully understand what we're intending to do, then a high fidelity prototype is going to be very important, because we don't want them to look at it and interpret it to be something different. Also, with the tools today that we have, making high fidelity things is very, very quick. It doesn't take much time at all. I think the trouble we get into is a lot of people mix up resolution and fidelity. And so they'll immediately think of high resolution things when they're thinking high fidelity. And keeping the resolution low is a thing that can allow us to move much quicker.
Can you give an example? So with low resolution, you mean something very simple as you explained in the door?
Yeah, so the door, I would say the door, kind of fitting through the door, that was very low fidelity, but maybe high resolution because it was the exact dimensions and it mimicked the behavior very well. in some ways it's high. That one's kind of medium on resolution, maybe, and a very low fidelity because it didn't look anything like the real thing. But as far as size, it was exactly the same, but it couldn't pass audio, right? Whereas like if we were thinking about a piece of software, for instance, we can make it very high fidelity, but maybe the name's hard coded. So even when you look at it, it says, "Hi, Bob," right? And it doesn't have your data, right? It doesn't, it says like, "Oh, your address is in Milwaukee." And you're like, "Well, I don't live in Milwaukee." But a lot of times the resolution stuff is easy enough for people to get past, right? They can grok the fact that like, oh, if I was Bob, this is what I would see. Like we're used to kind of understanding that, oh, everyone has their own profile and their own login. But sometimes it's important to have high resolution as well, because what we're testing might, like if it's a very data specific solution and someone experiencing their own data is the magic moment, and we can't really get the feedback or the reaction until they experience exactly that, then we want to go high resolution as well.
So is maybe one reason that we focus on high fidelity instead of high resolution first is because it's easy to waste our time on things to make them look good and then have a great first impression, but then they lack in depth, because this would mean more understanding and more getting to the core of the problem that we actually try to prototype?
Well, I would say that one reason that I think fidelity is a lot easier to achieve in most cases. It really depends on the question you are trying to answer, though, because sometimes higher resolution would be easier, but in many cases, the higher fidelity is easier to accomplish, and it gets us like 80 or more % of the way there. So if I were to like go high resolution, especially in the design sprint, I would have to test with maybe 5 different prototypes or 5 different variants of it, right? One for each tester. It's been dialed in for them. And so you just get diminishing returns. There's some scenarios where that is what you hope to learn, like it's going to impact your insights, because like let's say we're doing a recommendation engine, and it's really important for someone to experience that recommendation engine and these very personalized recommendations. If we were to have just a standard recommendation that had no, let's say, information or didn't take into account any context related to that individual, then, we may get less exciting reactions, right? Because people don't have that visceral connection to it. It's like, it's not doing it for them. So it's those kinds of scenarios where the resolution could potentially be more powerful or would be necessary, really.
So what kind of prototype is the most likely to survive this workshop scenario? So because we want to talk about what comes after the prototype, beyond the prototype.
Yeah.
So what's in the way usually, and what do you need to fulfill as minimum requirements for a prototype in order to survive the beyond phase?
Yeah, I don't see that many folks struggling with the prototype itself per se. It's really how the behaviors after the workshop that's the most problematic. And as far as the prototype itself, I'd say 80% or more of folks are getting that stuff right. I think the biggest challenges people have are when they think, oh, I've got a designer. Meanwhile, that designer is maybe a graphic designer or someone who does brochures and hasn't thought much about developing or designing user experiences. And so the prototype is a bit of a stretch for them conceptually, right? And it's definitely not a muscle that they've flexed much. And another problem with the prototype is folks not realizing, and this is again more behavior stuff, but not realizing that they need to invest in the prototype, because often you will learn things from your prototype, and those learnings are kind of adding to your pile of questions that you need to answer. And then you might have questions that are still unanswered, right? Like maybe after the after contact with your customers or your users, you realize that, there's a flaw in your prototype or in some of your assumptions. So you had to go back, make some tweaks, and run the test again. And part of it could be that there was something you hoped that they would like that just didn't resonate or didn't land with them. But it could also be ways that you constructed it that after observing them use it, you realize that maybe your idea isn't flawed, but how you packaged it up just just went over their head. They just kind of didn't understand it, and that's also something that would need to go back. You need to go back and revisit, because you could have something that everybody would love, but they just don't understand it enough to realize it's the thing they want or the thing they really need. Mm-hmm. And so any of those things, whether it's like new insights that open up new possibility, or things that people shut down, or things that people didn't understand, all these things have to be revisited. And ideally, you kind of, in very rapid succession, start to like iterate on the prototype and get to this kind of deeper understanding of kind of where the prototype could go and where it needs to go. And the other thing is, I think it's pretty applicable to the work you do, is this fact that the design sprint is super prescriptive, and people can just kind of open the book, even flip to the back at the checklist, and then run the design sprint. And what happens after is a real need for facilitated leadership and an understanding on how you can adopt the mindset, cultivate the culture around this way of working. And there's no great recipe for that, right? There's no like, oh, this is how to run meetings like a workshop. This is how to revisit our prototype. This is how to make sure that we're aligned on a shared narrative and these kinds of things. And to me, that's the real crux of the issue, is this just general lack of facilitated leadership inside of organizations. And the design sprint allowed people a taste of what that looks like over a week. But it's important to maintain those behaviors and grow that kind of, I would say, discipline within inside your company, or work with a partner that can help you do it. But to me, that if I really boiled it all down to like one simple principle, one truth, it's that, right? People need to learn how to work better together in meetings.
Do you ever feel you're tired of the trip from home to the home office? That the physical confines of your house are not getting you the exposure to the new ideas that you need? Maybe you need Mastermind. At Mastermind, you work together with a group of peers who help you bring new perspectives to your challenges, to find new solutions, and who you can even give a little bit back to by helping them solve their problems. In a compressed 2 hours, you'll get a day's worth of learning. So why don't you get out of that box and come to Mastermind? workshops.work/mastermind.
And I think it's also what I hear when you described all the iterations that actually come after the first prototype. How to keep not only the momentum, but the excitement, because I think it's a very thin line between excitement and frustration. So you're testing the first prototype. Everyone is really curious, generally curious to see how the potential user would react. And then let's say the potential user doesn't even know what to do with that. So total rejection. So how can you actually build up again this excitement to go into the next phase instead of just being frustrated and losing motivation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's highly dependent on the team and the motivators and drivers there. I think that ideally people that are engaged in this type of work are naturally curious. And so any sort of negative type of reactions will lead to just more like desire to understand why. That's not always the case. Even the most curious people can fall victim to these moments of frustration. So my main thing is just tap into the child's mind, stay curious, and try to figure out how we turn these things into learnings. And at the end of the day, if we have a diverse team that's cross-functional, there's going to be times where people are frustrated, because when you're in the zone of this land of generation, like we're doing generative types of things where we're creating ideas or adding to the pile of possibility, then your engineers, your builders, your developers, your problem solvers are going to all be fairly uncomfortable and frustrated, because to them, it's just like, they spent their entire career learning how to keep the bridge from falling down, right? And so it's all about constraints and rules and whatnot. And so when all this stuff's just piling up, it's just like overwhelming. And then likewise, when we're starting to execute and dial in the delivery and bringing the stuff to light, that's when the engineers and the architects, the mathematicians, those are the moments they thrive on, right? Because we're getting the specificity and we're reducing the number of variables, right? And we're constraining cost. Project managers love those zones. And then there's a classic middle where we're trying to hold space so that things can collide, and we don't want to lock in like too much in the way of like, hey, this is the official plan, this is what we're doing. But we're also trying to limit the amount of stuff that we add onto the plate, because we just can't, there's no more room. We're kind of overflowing already, but we want to allow the things to kind of gestate and kind of what kind of collisions and intersections can surface and allow new things to emerge. And so when I think about those phenomenons and how different members of the team are going to struggle at different times, and really trying to set folks up for success by, making sure that they understand that, hey, this is a moment you might be frustrated in, or even carving out opportunities for them to like work on the next piece, be thinking about like, well, where can we put these perspectives to use? And if we need everyone thinking about the thing that frustrates you, then maybe just making it apparent so that we can understand and let that be okay.
What I hear from what you're saying is there are two parts in keeping the level of frustration low and everyone involved. One is expectation management, just by making it clear that these moments might arise. And then the second one is to design for it so that you would have the different participants and their backgrounds being active at different points in time, or even making them more active in moments where they're actually more passive. Is this what you...
Yeah, and I think that not everyone has that luxury, depending on the size of the team. If you're a really small team, then, you may not be able to have as much ability to design in when different participants are involved, right? You might need that generative power from everyone, and you have to rely on the expectation setting. And, it's another thing is I found that even though it's not a perfect science, and even if you end up involving everyone in every activity or every phase, just being aware of it allows you to hold space for them. So it's almost like this, and you as a facilitator, you're trying to internalizing this kind of possible outcome, and you can kind of show up more for them. So in a way, it's like, just even thinking about it in your design, even if it only has a subtle nuance, or even if you're the only one that's aware of it, it can be a helpful thing. And absolutely, an expectation setting is, super powerful for facilitators, because if you seed it before you need it, then in the moment, it can be so much easier to get people to come along. So if they already know they're going to be frustrated, when they get frustrated, you can say, I told you so. Yeah. And it's almost like a magic trick. So they're like, oh, you did. And so then, because in the moment, if they're frustrated and you haven't planted that seed, and you try to convince them, they're like, oh no, it always happens this way. They think it's some BS, right? But if they've already heard it ahead of time, it's like, oh, he knows what he's talking about, or she knows what she's talking about, because they are, she already told me this. And so now they're just going to be in the moment a little more willing to come down off the cliff. And
it can be so relieving, because then you basically make a joke out of it. So, okay, I warned you. And then everyone
Yep.
is like, yeah, I didn't want to listen. And this eases the entire situation. And
Yep.
then might even take a little bit of the frustration away, because it's not them alone who will feel this frustration, but they know it's okay, it's part of the game, and they're one of many.
Yes, absolutely. And have you heard of a concept called labeling with regards to emotions?
Mm-hmm.
So it comes from negotiation work that, where hostage negotiators, etc. And when you label, the fascinating thing is when you label a positive emotion, it tends to amplify it. So if I said, "Hey, you seem really happy today,"
mm-hmm.
You probably light up a little more,
mm-hmm.
right? When you label negative emotions, it diminishes that negativity. So if I say, "You seem really frustrated,"
mm-hmm.
then you'll be a little less frustrated. And it also opens up the possibility for more specificity or better understanding, because you might say, "Oh, I'm not frustrated. I'm just really pissed off."
Mm-hmm.
And then that allows me to say, "Well, what are you pissed off about?"
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because so it's a great way to just open that conversation and allow that dialogue to happen in a way that would maybe go deeper than otherwise. And I just find that really awesome. And how often, I know there's so many times when I've seen someone steam and I think I'll just kind of avoid them.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas it's a real interesting invitation to engage, because if you think about the fact that even empathizing with the fact that whatever they're going through and trying to connect on that will help them maybe emerge out of it a little bit.
Yeah, and to help them to connect to themselves, and also to make them feel seen, which is a very comforting thing as such.
Absolutely. And, it's, as I was saying, the behaviors post workshop matter so much, because we've got this framework that we can religiously follow, and then we kind of come out of it with a prototype, but then what's next, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so making sure that we're thinking about how we hold space for the team so that they understand what success and failure looks like, and how we're going to guide this thing out to whatever teams that might take this thing over. Because typically what I see in large companies is, there's kind of a team that's dedicated to harvesting and understanding where a potential might lie. They may even hand it off to another team, or they might shepherd it for a little while, but eventually someone's going to take it and to own it and kind of release it to the world. And, I typically hear that referred to as tech transfer or transfer, where you're transferring it from this kind of incubation team over into product or whatever team you might call that's going to see it through. And typically these teams are meant to be, or designed to be nimble and quick, and the teams that they hand it off to might be using agile or these other processes, but these quick and nimble teams, if they're adopting the design sprint, it's going to leapfrog them into the future, if you will. They're going to gain a ton of momentum. And if they're not used to having all that momentum, they don't know what it feels like. Then you can't anticipate that, right? Yeah. We talked earlier about expectation setting. Yeah. So even understanding that I'm going to be strapped to a rocket ship, but I've never been strapped to a rocket ship before. What's it like to be there, and how do I steer this thing once I'm there?
And how can I label then my own emotions? Is it basically to avoid overwhelm? Because overwhelm is just a feeling that arises from too much information and no way how to structure it. And this leads me to something you mentioned earlier, that what comes after this workshop where you design a prototype is actually the need for facilitative leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So to what extent would you distinguish the need for a facilitative leadership versus a facilitator? Facilitating facilitator.
Yeah. I think that it really depends on the skills of leadership. That is one, bringing in an external facilitator is absolutely one way to get facilitated leadership, right? Because having leadership realize that it's important that the teams kind of be, let's say, set up so that everyone can work at the height of all of their intelligence, right? So that no one's diminished and that we make sure that we're capitalizing on all our resources. To me, that's true leadership. And not all leaders need to be skilled facilitators, but the more they can learn how to do these things, the better. Because there's going to be situations in everyday meetings where it doesn't make sense to bring in an external facilitator. But how can we make sure to learn some of the tricks, some of the skills, right? And make sure we're thinking about our teams, bringing our teams together to do the best work they can do. I think there's some things that leaders can start to adopt, but then also realizing that there are moments where we do need to bring in an external, whether it's external to our group. I've seen a lot of companies start to build facilitation practices within their companies, which I think is fantastic, or even reaching outside the company and bringing a facilitator in. But my point is, like, culturally, how can we start to make sure that no matter what meeting you're in or who's hosting the meeting, if you send out the calendar invite, you're the facilitator, or you've appointed someone else to do it. I think that's the crux of it, because regardless of whether or not it's time to bring in an external, because that's a whole conversation. But if you that someone needs to be facilitating the meeting, and let's move away from just lists of topics as agendas. You know, like, we're going to spend the time to come together. And meetings are expensive. We're going to spend the time to do that. Let's at least invest in designing an experience for people, or using one that's well crafted. And I think that so often meetings are just, we have a list of topics we're going to talk about, or as a status report, or we just need to talk about something. So let's have a meeting. And there's just not enough time spent thinking about the design and how it's gonna flow.
Yeah, and I could totally geek out on the topics of meetings. But before that, I would like to come back to another thing that is maybe at the interface. So when would be the moment for you to hand over the stick of facilitating as an external? So you're in charge of the design sprint. You developed the prototype. Maybe you had 2 or 3 iterations. When is the moment to hand over to this hopefully facilitating leader?
Yeah. So I guess it really depends on, for us personally, we mostly hand off after the design sprint. So we're sometimes we'll help with the iterations, whatnot, but we're really hoping we can build the capacity of the team. I know there's other agencies that kind of are dip more into the product design, product development kind of stuff, but we try to stay purely in the facilitation realm or world. We will bring prototypers with us, because having done lots of design sprints, we know and work with prototypers. And so if someone's in a pinch and we really need to wrap it up as far as like the learnings and getting the prototype in good shape, we'll help out with some of those iterations. But typically, more times than not, we come in, do the design sprint, and then leave. But one of the last things we're doing as we hand off the recap deck and are coaching the main sponsor is making sure that they have a clear understanding of what those next steps look like. I give them a copy of Beyond the Prototype and say, think about these things. Also, I ask them to make sure they book their internal retro meeting. So they gather the entire team to reflect on the insights, to think about what those next steps look like. And then I send them periodic emails saying, hey, what are your next steps? And I'm just looking for like any warning signs where like they never had their retro, or they don't really seem to have a very clear narrative. And I'm just kind of like pointing back to like things that I talk about in the book as a nice little, like, it's almost like we were talking about the expectation setting was like, here's the book. And then when the things pop up, I can say, okay, see what I was talking about? And so then it kind of cements like, oh yes, you did say that would be a problem. So hopefully, the leaders are starting to pick up on some of these things. And at least that's my goal, is when I'm telling them about hosting the retro and how to adopt these things, then they're starting to like facilitate some of these meetings. And, we take a very organic approach, if you will, hoping the teams will start to adopt some of these behaviors and they'll bubble up from the ground, like a grassroots kind of thing, versus like we're going to go top down and get the leadership and transforming the entire company or whatever.
So for someone who hasn't read the book, what would be the key ingredients to help then the organization to keep the momentum and to move beyond the prototype after you left? Because I assume that you don't take responsibility in what happens after, although you're curious and you want to support.
Yeah, we certainly haven't signed up to ship it or to create it or make it, but there's a certain responsibility I feel deep in my bones on the, we set this thing in motion, and it means so much to our customers, value and even the potential future of design sprints, right? Because
it's a reputational thing.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want people saying, oh, those things don't work because people get lofty ideas and they don't go anywhere. And so we take a lot of responsibility, but it's more from a coaching kind of or a guide from the side kind of thing. And so we'll take ownership from that standpoint, just kind of checking in and seeing how things are going. But as far as, seeing it through, the most important thing is to set the stage. So there's a lot of things we need to do up front to make sure that design sprints or just any workshop or ideation session is set up for success. So, we talked earlier about expectation setting, that applies here. Making sure you've got the right participants, making sure you're even working on the right problem. It's like if you ain't get the wrong thing, it's not gonna, it's much harder to go beyond the prototype if you pick the wrong problem, right? So there's stuff that you need to do up front. Even your decider, there's a very distinct role in the design sprint we call the decider that means that it's the person that's going to call the shots, right? Well, if we pick the wrong person, then whoever the real decider is could easily shut it down later. Or either if it's the wrong person, they might not have authority to push it forward. So these kind of set the stage things are really important to get right, because then if you don't do those things right, then it may be impossible to undo them after the design sprint, and you're kind of stuck in the slump and you don't know how to get out. Or you maybe have to do another design sprint to get out, which is not ideal, right? And then you want to make sure you wrap it up. We talked about a little bit about that today, this notion of revisiting the questions that are unanswered, answering any new questions that might have surfaced, so sort of tweaking the prototype and testing again. So you want to do those iterations. Some people call them iteration sprints and kind of bake them in. Some people assume that you can do a sprint followed by one iteration sprint, and then you're good to go. I don't think the world's quite that simple. I think that planning for the fact that iterations need to happen, but you can't be prescriptive in the sense that you'll exactly one iteration sprint and you're good to go. Because then otherwise people set that expectation gets set, and then they come out of that one iteration sprint and they're just they're hell bent on building that, and that might not be the right thing to build, and that can be really detrimental to momentum. But because you can be full steam ahead, trying to build just so confident that you're doing the thing, and then just pieces are flying off as you're going down the highway, and you don't stop to look until it's way too late. The other thing is crafting the narrative. So making sure that you have a really crisp narrative. When I do the Beyond the Prototype workshop, I ask people, what's the worst thing you could hear after a workshop from a customer? And it's kind of a trick question because, most of the time people say oh, it was really horrible, or, this and that. And people just saying really, really just hurtful things about the workshop or whatever. And then after everyone's kind of done airing all that, then I say, well, the worst thing I have ever heard from feedback from workshop was it was a lot of fun. Because if I hear that from a sponsor, then it tells me that the team's not communicating any of the value we extracted. And the thing is, so we as facilitators need to make sure that we help the teams understand any of the alignment we created. They need to have language around that alignment and the outcomes we created. And if we don't rehearse that, if we don't identify it and make it very specific, when someone gets stopped in the hallway at the water cooler, then or just getting called up on the phone, you're going to go to an emotional space. And workshops are fun we make them fun because playful curiosity leads to much more effective outcomes. So instead of just leaving it to chance, we're going to take the time to craft a narrative because we were all in the same meeting and it should sound like it.
So at what point would you do that and how would you do that? Can you guide us through?
I really love to do it at the end of the workshop. It's a great way to close. Like one of my favorite ways to close is to create the shared narrative and then do something we call commitment buddies, which is basically like everyone finds someone ideally in a department you don't usually work with. And that way that continues this cross-pollination stuff that's really valuable. And you just basically say to them, what am I going to do in 2 days, 2 weeks, and 2 months?
Awesome.
And you can change those time frames to be whatever makes sense for your project. It could be in 2 hours. Yeah. Right. And as far as the narrative building, there's many different ways to do that. You can share out. We've got some different narrative frameworks that we'd like to share out in our facilitation training. We've leaned on those at the time in workshops to help people think about, here's a structure you could use. I also really like to encourage folks to think about the audiences. Because,
so what is the structure? Sorry, before you get onto the audience, what would be the structure that you use?
So structures, the ones that we'll teach are the hero's journey. So that's a pretty popular structure. Pixar has got a really cool structure that's called it's Pixar storytelling tip number 4. And I think they call it the spark line. No, that's Nancy Duarte's, which is also another great one. She has this technique for mapping out speeches or any story. And it's almost like musical notation, but it's like for like recording how a speech maybe transpires. And there's this really interesting concept in there around this contrast between the way the world is and then the way the world could be. Because it seems like people spend a ton of time talking about the how bad things are, or they spend a ton of time talking about the vision. And if they do talk about both, they kind of they talk about all the bad things and then all the good things. But like there's a lot of power. There's a lot of power in just the microscopic bad thing along with the microscopic good thing. And then you just kind of seesaw back and forth. That can be really powerful because then people are equating here's this negative element and here's the fix for that element. Here's another negative, rather than the sea of negativity and then the sea of positivity. It's it's interleaved in a way that people can kind of they're going to remember more, right? Because they hear the bad thing coupled with the good thing.
So the narrative building, would you do it with the entire group or in subgroups or individually? And how do you bring it together? And just in a nutshell, because we need to wrap up very quickly.
Yeah, I know. We've been chatting for a while. Yes, that probably depends on the size of the group as to whether or not I would break into subgroups. I would not try to do a shared narrative building with more than 7 people before I would probably break. So just kind of following general kind of cadence and grouping types of rules. I am a big fan of individual work, so I generally have folks think about their what they think it should be, and then we'll have some form of turn taking that will allow everyone to kind of surface up their ideas. If it's a small enough group, we may even do something similar to a note and vote. If it's a really large group, we can do breakouts. We can do 1, 2 for all. There's lots of different ways to slice that, but ultimately allowing people to think, have a moment to think about, do some journaling on what they think it should be. Also, on the participants or the audience side, allowing the teams to be involved in deciding who their audiences are and how they might need to segment their messages. For instance, if you're a parent-teacher association, you might have a different message for parents and a different one for teachers. Yeah. And it's not because we're trying to be deceptive. It's just because they have different concerns. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And so another easy one to think about would be the people above you that you report to, the people that report to you, and then people that are lateral, like maybe there are peers that you have in the organization, and they may have different concerns. Even different departments might want to hear different things. It might be employees of your company versus employees of a partner's company. Yeah. At the end of the workshop, you're going to know, because you're going to be deep inside the problem. You're going to know who your stakeholders are. And I wouldn't say craft a different message for all stakeholders, but just think about, is there important nuance that's going to drive you to have a different message? And if so, then pull them out, think about them as separate, And the power, here's the thing. If you rehearse the narrative, if you prepare it, then everyone's aligned. So we're all saying the same thing. There's a ton of resilience. It makes it much more robust, because if you have everyone saying different things, imagine you ran into like 3 people you work with and they're all telling you different things about what they did. You don't trust it.
Yeah.
You're like, did they even have their act together? Like, what are they doing?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then also,
same workshop. Yeah.
Exactly. And then also, if you haven't rehearsed it, if you haven't thought about what you're going to say, you're not necessarily tapping into it's almost like the pop quiz you didn't study for. It's like, this stuff, but you're just caught off guard.
Yeah. Last question. According to you, what makes a workshop fail?
Man, there's so many reasons why a workshop can fail. Maybe my favorite one is when people don't want to be there. And I think that's a real, to me, well, let me tell you, the first thing that popped into my head was lack of preparation. But I think it's more juicy to talk about this. There's a ton we could talk about there, but just this notion of people who don't want to be there, because there's this whole notion of including everyone and holding space for people. But at the end of the day, if someone doesn't want to be there, or the worst case, the pathological case is like everyone doesn't want to be there. So during our planning process, and I guess coming back to being prepared, that's one of the things that we really try to understand who all's in the room and what expectations have been set with them. Yeah. Because a nod to Priya Parker, your workshop doesn't start before the workshop, or your gathering doesn't start when they walk through the threshold. If you're hosting a wedding, like the minute they show up at the church is not when that event started for them. That event started for them when they got the save the date card.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true.
And, thinking about how you craft every moment. Yeah. So we're over time, but yeah, I think that's the thing is, we've just been asking people, what they hope to get out of things, and do they even want to be in the room?
Yeah. Cool. If someone fell asleep after minute 1 and just woke up and doesn't have time to listen to the entire show again, what would be the nugget you want to give them?
Wow, we talked about quite a few things. The nugget for someone who fell asleep, and I think it's all about the behaviors after a workshop, and how can we continue to tap into the power of room intelligence and facilitated leadership in ways that can transform companies.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time and sharing the insights. I guess that everyone is now curious to read the book, and I will put the link to the book and to your company, Voltage Control, in the show notes.
Excellent. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention, as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.